we're going to look at the actual homiletic side of the book of Mark. We've looked at the introduction to it. What I want to do to begin with is give an overview of the 8 steps that you're going to take in preparing this sermon, and then focus on choose the passage. Here's a neat little book on preaching. It's a unique book. It's a first-person account of Bruce Mahany, who was a pastor. His preaching had gone stale, and he wanted to bring some life back into it. So he goes back to his homiletic teacher in seminary, and the book is a first-person account of how that seminary teacher helped him bring life back into his preaching. Howard Hendricks read the book and said, if more books on preaching were as interesting as this, then perhaps we would have more interesting preachers. So we hope that we can be more interesting preachers. In the book, Bruce Mahany gives this bit of advice. Start early in your sermon preparation, whether that's Monday for Sunday's sermon or getting like ahead of time 6 months in preparation for a new series. So here's the steps that we want to take to get started early. Choose the passage, study the passage, and then discover the main point of the passage. Tony Merida calls this the main point of the sermon, MPS. Once you have the main divisions, once you get the main point of the sermon, then you'll get your sermon outline or your main divisions, and then you will develop those main divisions with 4 rhetorical processes: explanation, argumentation, illustration, application. Then you'll write the introduction because you know what to introduce, and the conclusion. And the 8th step is how to preach so people will listen. How can we preach so that we can be not just interesting, but persuasive? So we're going to start with step 1, choose the passage. Here's another book that I've found very helpful. It's on the expository genius of John Calvin, and I think you would really enjoy this book. It just talks about how John Calvin was dedicated to expository preaching. He, verse by verse, preached through all these books: Genesis, Deuteronomy, Job, Judges, Samuel, Kings, major and minor prophets, Gospels, Acts, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews. We think of John Calvin as the theologian, but he was also an expository preaching. On one occasion in Geneva, the city council banned him, exiled him. And that's before separation of church and state. And that's one of the downsides of having no separation of church and state. So they banned him because he would not allow members living in open sin to participate in the Lord's Supper. But the city began to struggle, so the city council invited him back. And in September 1541, Calvin re-entered the Genevan pulpit 3 years later and said, now in the next verse. That's awesome. He went right back to preaching verse by verse through a book. That leads us into our first point: 2 ways to choose a passage. One way to choose a passage is in a series which has many built-in advantages, so that when you get through with one sermon, you go to the next sermon, you can say, now in the next verse. Tony Merida, in the book that you're reading, gives some helpful tips on that. He says if you've never preached through a book, your church has never had a book verse by verse preached through, start with a smaller book like Philippians. But there are some downsides or disadvantages to preaching through series. One is members become weary when the series is too long. If the series dies, dismount. What you can do is find a good stopping point in the book. So you're preaching through Romans, you finish the section on sin, you stop at Romans 3:20, go away, come back later, and start on the section in justification. Another disadvantage is not variety in preaching. You're in Romans. You've been in Romans for a long, long time. But you can remedy that. The next series could be the very opposite. Or if you're doing two series at the same time, you can contrast Romans on Sunday morning to Proverbs on your next preaching service for that week. So you have a contrast between New Testament, Old Testament. You have New Testament epistles genre. You have Hebrew poetry genre. You have verse by verse. You have thematic. Proverbs covers many themes like words and anger, etc., money, poverty, laziness. So you have a good contrast there. The second way that you can choose a passage, first is in a series. The second is when you are not in a series. These are more difficult, I think. But once a year, you could have a state of the church sermon, or you could preach on special times, special holidays like Christmas, Easter. Maybe there's a crisis in your church or crisis in your community. You could address that. Here's another good book by Jerry Vines and Jim Shattuck on the power of preaching, or power in the pulpit. It goes more in depth than Tony Merita's book, and it also gives you tips on how to preach series and then sermons that are not in series. So let's think about how to plan and preach a series of sermons. Getting ahead of time or getting that early start is really important. Haddon Robinson, who is known as the guru of preaching for many, many decades, not only has a book on how to preach, but he has a book of biblical sermons. There's 12 preachers, 12 sermons here. And Haddon Robinson gives the sermon. He makes his comments on the sermon. And the third part of this is he interviews the preacher. And so in one of those interviews, he interviews Jim Rose, and Haddon Robinson asks him, how do you prepare for a series of sermons? And he says he's either from a year to 6 months by reading through the book, having his devotions out of the book that he will later preach a series of sermons from. I thought that is a great idea. So he's reading, he's building, he's finding the main point of the passage, he's writing out his outlines. He's just internalizing that book. In addition to getting an early start by reading through the book over and over again, G. Campbell Morgan, who has a series of sermons in book form, said he would before he preached through a book, he would read it 40 to 50 times. And so when you read his sermons, they're just so analytical. Well, they're analytical because he read through the book so many times. But Augustine, who wrote the first book on homiletics called On Christian Doctrine, taught his students to improve their preaching, they should read good sermons, listen to great preaching. And he was a teacher of rhetoric. He was a rhetorician. He was like a teacher of public speech. But he said more important than studying rhetoric or public speech is to read good sermons, listen to good sermons. You get content, but their preaching skill may rub off on you. When I was preaching through Nehemiah the first time, I listened to sermons, audio sermons by Warren Wiersbe, Adrian Rogers, and John Whitcomb. And it just helped so much. Another source would be Stephen Davey. I mentioned that when we talked about resources, and Stephen Coles. If they're preaching through a book, then I listen to their sermons. And then here's a good tip on using a variety of commentaries. This is from Donald Sanukian. But you can use exegetical commentaries, expositional commentaries, or synthesis commentaries, as Donald Sanukian calls them, or sermonic commentaries. And each of these will help you with some part of your sermon. You have, under each main division, you have explanation. answering the question, what do these verses mean? Your exegetical commentary is going to help you with that. Then you have argumentation. How do you know that's the meaning? Again, the expositional and the exegetical commentary can help you answer this listener's question. Illustration. What does it look like? Give me a concrete example. This is where your sermonic commentaries can give you application, which is next. What does this have to do with my life? And illustration. Donald Sunukjian says we should use commentaries in that order. Use the synthesis commentary first to get the big picture of the passage that you're preaching. And commentaries like Bible Knowledge Commentary, Thomas Constable at netbible.org can help us get the big picture. Once you get the big picture, then use your exegetical, or sometimes called critical commentaries, not because they're critical of the text, but just because they're more detailed. And when I was doing preaching to Ephesians, I used Howard Honer's book on Ephesians, which is 900 pages and very thorough, 20 pages of exegesis on each paragraph in Ephesians. So that gives you that in-depth. And then the third kind of commentary is the sermonic. And these would be like commentaries by John MacArthur and Warren Wiersbe. Again, Donald Sunukjian says, do this order: synthesis, exegetical, sermonic. Don't start with sermonic, because you may just want to stop there when you read that and say, that'll preach. But you want to make sure that the preacher of the sermon got the text right. Here's another bit of advice that I've found helpful. In addition to commentaries and listening to sermons, read related books to the subject of the book. For example, in Ephesians, the book is the unity in the church. So when I was preaching through Ephesians, I read Mark Dever's book, The 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, and John Hammett's book on ecclesiology, the biblical foundation for Baptist churches. They give you additional material and application for the modern day church issues, problems. And so I just found that to be very helpful. If you're preaching through Mark on discipleship, then read books on discipleship. Gives you additional material, additional examples and illustrations, and ways that you can relate it to the passage. I hope this discussion of the first step, choose the passage, will be helpful.